In July 2017, a community event was held on the quayside of Piel dock in Barrow-In-Furness to celebrate 150 years of the port of Barrow. Before the opening of the Devonshire dock in 1867 and Piel dock in 1873, this plaque would have stood on the shoreline of the small farming and fishing village of Barrow or Barrow Head. Just across the tidal channel was Old Barrow Island, which even as late as 1863 was a peaceful area of pastureland and crops managed by the Barrow Island Farm. From 1726, a fine house known as Michelson House or Michelson Mansion also looked over the channel to Barrow Head. This small island estate was finally sold to the Duke of Devonshire and the Furness Railway in 1863, when an Act of Parliament finally gave permission to push on with the dock building. This lit the blue touch paper on the industrial boom which created the town of Barrow-In-Furness with its ironworks, shipyards and docks. But these islands and villages at the tip of the Furness Peninsula were here long before they were transformed into the town we know today. We just have to look a little deeper behind the present day to see what we used to be before the arrival of the railway in 1846 and before the old way of life began to disappear as pasture lands gave way to the port. During the last ice age, glaciers covered most of the Lake District. As they melted and left behind the deposits of rock, sand and boulder clay that they were carrying, they formed the rolling hills of Lower Furness and the low-lying islands off its coast. These glacial deposits were put down over more ancient sandstones and limestones, which would later become a part of the story of Barrow. The glacial lake which was the Duddon Valley left behind sediments which formed Walney. Even today, Lake District slates and granites can be found in the pebbles on these beaches. Walney became Furness's protective barrier against tides and gales from the Irish Sea. There is evidence of Neolithic people living on Walney, and Anglo-Saxons arrived in Lower Furness in the 7th century, but many local place names suggest that Furness was first properly inhabited by Norse settlers coming from Ireland and the Isle of Man in the 9th century. The Norse word Barre, meaning Bear Island, was the name given to Barrow Island. These Viking settlers left behind buried treasure in the form of the Furness hoard of coins, discovered in 2011 and on display in the Dock Museum. Like many other Low Furness villages, Barrow was founded as a grange or a farm by the Cistercian monks of Furness Abbey, who arrived here in 1127 from Savigny in France. First mentioned in monastic records in 1190, the Grange of Barre was situated in the area that today slopes down from Snyder Square towards Piel dock and along the Strand towards St George's Square. Barrow Island and Walney also had granges farmed by the monks of Furness Abbey, and the whole area remained peacefully isolated and rural for centuries. By the 1700s, the small farming and fishing village of Barrow Head on the shores of the Barrow Channel had begun exporting local iron ore found in the limestones of the west coast and Lower Furness. This is a watercolour of the Barrow Channel painted in 1844 by Jane Michelson, who married Thomas Michelson of Barrow Island in 1841. The painting is in the Dock Museum collection. This scene looks from the southern tip of Barrow Island up the Barrow Channel towards the village of Barrow, with Black Combe in the distance. 4 jetties were built into the channel from the Barrow side along the present-day strand, the first in 1790 and the last and nearest built by ironmaster Henry Snyder in 1842 near what is now the Harbour Pub. Michelson House itself stood on the channel shore directly opposite the present supermarket and car park on the strand. This is another of Jane Michelson's later paintings and is on display in the Dock Museum. The arrival of the railways in the 1840s allowed the exploitation of new huge iron ore deposits discovered at the Park Mine near Askham in 1850 by ironmaster Henry Snyder. These turned out to be the second largest hematite deposits in the country and laid the foundation for the iron and steel works and shipbuilding which would soon create the boom town of Barrow. Black Combe is one of the most familiar sights from the town of Barrow-In-Furness and has been so for thousands of years. From its summit today we can see the port and shipbuilding town of Barrow, but by contrast, in his 1810 guidebook to the lakes, William Wordsworth recalls seeing Walney's early fields of corn from this very same viewpoint. William Wordsworth was no stranger to Lower Furness, and this engraving appeared in the first edition of his 1810 guidebook. In his poem The Prelude, he writes of visiting Furness Abbey, probably in the early 1780s, as a schoolboy from Hawks's Head. In late summer 1794, he spent a month on holiday at Rampside with an uncle and cousin, possibly at Bow Windows Farm, although it's more likely that he stayed in the building which is now the Clark's Arms. William wrote a poem inspired by the view of Piel Island and its castle, the same view that we can still see today. It's hard to imagine that William didn't spend time exploring the other islands, visiting the Abbey, and maybe visiting the village of Barrow Head, or Biggar, North Scale, New Barnes, or Harcourt. In 1840 he wrote again about Furness Abbey after a visit, at a time when the ruins were gradually being reclaimed by time and nature. Furness Abbey obviously meant very much to William Wordsworth. He was outraged to hear in June 1845 that railway navvies were working on the site and that landowner William Cavendish was proposing to drive the first Furness railway line through the site, so close to the Great East Window that he was even ready to demolish some of the ruins to get the line through the valley. In a new, quite angry poem, William made the point that even the railway labourers are moved by the beauty and spirit of the place. He condemns the board of the newly formed Furness Railway Company in very strong words in the last 2 lines of the sonnet. William Wordsworth was a great conservationist and a campaigner against the railways. He believed they would spoil the natural beauty of his Lake District if their building was not controlled. As poet laureate, his published poems and letters seem to have carried some force with the Furness protest. The planned line was moved away from the east window, so far in fact that it forced the building of the short tunnel we know today to rejoin the valley a little further round. A few years later, the Yarlside or the Park House iron mine built a tramway which was to join the Furness railway line at Roos Station. This first Furness railway line was opened in 1846. its purpose to transport Kirby slates and Dalton and Lindell iron ore to Piel Pier at the Deepwater Harbour on Roe Island. This pier extended far out into the channel from the site of the present boat club. Piel Station itself was situated just where the causeway meets the island. William Wordsworth died in 1850 at the age of 80, just 4 years after the opening of the first Furness railway line. By this time, the development of Barrow was inevitable, and the changes to come in Furness over the next 30 years would be bigger than even William Wordsworth could ever have imagined.